Suemnicht, and you're listening to General Intellect Unit. This time we are picking up part 2 of our discussion of vital cells. If you didn't catch the first part, I'd recommend pausing this episode, going back one and starting from there. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the show. But I guess the reason the author's bringing all this stuff up is that he's going to move on to constructive proposals for getting beyond this this trap that we find ourselves in. We finally hit the vital cells section, where he's proposing this new form of organization.
Yes. So this is as you said, a new form of organization, and it's about personal and collective growth and overcoming obstacles together. So in that way, it is different from the wellness paradigm of let us all become better people on our own by being in proximity to one another and buying the same consumer goods. So it says in the article, drawing upon the organization of Alcoholics Anonymous, Vital Cells is an organizational model characterized by a distributed network of cells composed by interchangeable individuals who are animated by common principles in response to concrete problems. A network which is easily reproducible and which integrates feedback mechanisms to guide group development. So it is, about cells. It is about the network of cells, and it is about the collectives within these cells. Yeah.
Under the heading of Cybernetic Organization, he kind of puts forward we're not just talking about because I guess a lot of autonomous and leftists are kind of familiar with decentralized network and stuff as a kind of magic word that makes things cool. But we're not just going to do decentralized networks. We're going to have protocols and extrinsic relations to make this stuff work better. Extrinsic relations, it's placing the emphasis on the autonomy of individuals in relation to the cells. And maybe a shorthand for this is that these organizational cells don't engulf their members. I think this is being borrowed from Manuel de Landa. So there's a quote here. Unlike wholes in which being part of this whole is a defining characteristic of the parts, that is, wholes in which the parts cannot subsist independently of the relations they have with each other, so that would be relations of interiority, we need to conceive of emergent wholes in which parts retain their autonomy, so that they can detach from one whole and plug into another, entering into new interactions. So that's typical Delanda sort of pretty complex speak for explaining all that, but maybe the way to understand this is in, say, Nazism, being a member of the Aryan race is something that consumes your entire being, right? Your full identity as a person is fully identified with this engulfing relation.
Yeah, and your individuality is annihilated in the face of the existence of the Führer, right? Because the Führer is the only true individual. Everyone else are just sheeple. But by being a member of the Aryan race and the Nazi movement, you are subsumed into the greatness of the Führer as that individual, the true individual who manifests, meaningful aesthetic greatness in this world.
Mm-hmm. And so that's intrinsic relation, or relations of interiority. And then by contrast, extrinsic relations or relations of exteriority are where you do have an autonomous existence that can slip between these wholes, these larger structures that you're kind of relating to. So one of the kind of banal example that's very familiar to everyone is employment. Your life is not entirely consumed by the company that you're working for at any given time. Well, I mean, it shouldn't be. For a lot of people, it basically is. But, you can leave, you can go somewhere else, you can, go home and all that kind of stuff.
It's the false ideal of free labor under capitalism is it promises this extrinsic relation to work, right? That you're no longer a serf on the land, you're no longer a slave under a master, you're no longer an artisan whose father was a master, and then you have no choice in your life but to pursue the craft that they pursued. You're no longer a prince who must inherit the throne. You have an extrinsic relationship to the groups that you belong to. That is part of the liberty that capitalism promises, although it can only truly deliver it to the bourgeoisie.
Right. But like wage labor is still an all engulfing thing, right? Like you can shuttle from one employer to another, but like wage labor is still all consuming. So it's
you're either employed under the dominance of a bourgeois or a collective bourgeois, or you are in the reserve army of labor and you are superfluous to society and at the danger of starvation and not having all your basic needs met.
Yeah. But in this case, it does serve as an example of like one of the poles, or somewhere along towards one end of the scale on these things, because like you could compare the usual kind of employment that we're familiar with versus like being in the army, as like you sleep on base and you eat in the barracks and stuff. That's a more all-consuming thing, and that's less extrinsic. It's more intrinsic.
In situations of wage labor, we see that in like company towns or worker dormitories outside of factories, or Google, that kind of place where it's like, we provide you everything here so you never have to leave. So it's it's kind of, on the one hand you have Foxconn, where it's that totally militarized approach, and then it's you have something like Google, where the domination is completely internalized, as opposed to being extrinsically enforced through like actual physical punishment and regimentation.
Yeah, totally. The reason all this is relevant for the author is that in this model, the parts, the like human members, can and should belong to several cells simultaneously. So that this is interesting because in the network, the individuals become the edges in the network rather than the nodes. So then that's a really fun inversion of the usual way these kind of things are laid out, where like the individual human beings are nodes and it's the network that networks them together. Whereas in this case, it's human beings that act as the bridges between the cells, which are the organizational cells, which are the nodes of the network.
I don't know if this is strictly thinkable in terms of graph theory, because the thing about edges is that they only have two nodes they connect to. So you could be in an edge, like say in Syntegration, right? Let's say they inverted it and you were the edge. Well, you could relate to two groups, right? And those groups would have people in them, but you couldn't simultaneously relate to more than two groups.
Yeah, totally. I wonder if that's why the author picks 2 as the number of cells that a person should belong to, is because it fits with the graph analogy. But you could very easily imagine, just go to 3 cells, and the graph thing would break down. You're quite right.
Yes, which is something that like you actually cannot map in graph theory, because edges can only be between two things. That's just inherent to what it means to be a line, is that you're a two-dimensional shape between 2 points.
I don't know. Can we find some non-Euclidean geometry? I bet you though, even with non-Euclidean geometry, you still can't get out of that. Like a line has to join two things.
Yes. Well, because the thing in non-Euclidean geometry is that you have what is it? The principle of Euclidean geometry where lines converge with one another going towards the horizon doesn't apply. But that has no bearing on the inherent nature of what a line is. So I think that this may be a real theoretical problem that that needs to be thought through here, because like you could say, well, people are actually like distributed entities and they exist in multiple edges, but then the edges couldn't relate to the other edges except by means of nodes. So it's it would definitely, there's only weird solutions to this, and I don't know if any of them are satisfactory. I'd have to think about it more, but I do think it's a significant problem.
Yeah. This reminds me of some stuff that comes up in Beer's work, where he doesn't try to model people as edges, but he does kind of emphasize that, like, a lot of the System 2 and System 3, like, communication that happens between units happens because people actually go between the units. So that, like, if somebody is in 2 or 3 different working groups, their brain is the communication channel between the working groups. You know, so that's maybe for Beer, that's all a bit more kind of the kind of rhizomatic nervous system sort of stuff, where things get a bit squishy and wobbly anyway, and having these many multiple connections is a thing. But there's prior art on this, you know.
It also makes me think about Nora Badeson's talking about the reification inherent in these kinds of graphs, where she was talking about I think, like, questioning the solidity of edges, that, like, you know, we assume that these nodes and edges have a kind of meaningful existence, but they all really exist in a kind of functional process way, as opposed to a entity relation way. So that would be another way to approach this question. But I think we're sort of getting at, like, useful alternative ways of conceptualizing this, but I don't think that they actually address the particular problem with this idea.
No, indeed. There's an interesting point here that cells should be ephemeral. They should emerge in response to a situation and then dissolve. I think at some point later they'll say that they should actually have an expiration date built in, which is interesting, because it sort of steers a little bit against the emphasis on long-term viability that we find essential in Beer. And it might just be that for Beer, that's just the thing he cared about, was long-lasting institutions. But it's interesting to think of this, right? Like, institutions or organizational groups that just have a built-in expiration date, probably for the sake of freshness. Like, this is a thing that, like, comes up in biology, right? That, like, there's a reason individual cells in the body, and frankly individuals of the species, burn out and die. It's kind of to prevent stagnation in the line of things. That, like, it's better to have things blow up and be progressed beyond, rather than have them stick around pathologically.
It's why revolution is desirable.
You need change. Yeah, you need constant change. And I like that the author here has built that in as, like, no, these shouldn't be things that stick around terribly long. They should stick around as long as they need to and then dissolve. That should be considered normal for these things to break up.
So I think there is a side of Beer that would agree with this for sure, which is that, you know, when he talks about our existing government organizations or corporate organizations and how they're so out of date, they're so poorly adapted towards achieving the the goal of eudaimonia, and they're very poorly adapted to even achieving their own ostensible goals. Like, he's constantly wishing death upon them, right? And I think that, so I've been working in my PhD on a lot of sort of process philosophy. And I think that one useful way to think about it is that it's okay for a developing process to have a termination point, an end, as long as it's spawning desirable processes in the course of its existence, right? So that could be either cloning itself, or splitting into distinct processes, or having like sort of sexual reproduction with other processes, right? Like these things, there's a desirable continuity that goes on there that outlives the particular process, and it might, in retrospect, not even be recognizable as the end of one process and the beginning of another, because the later process subsumes what the old process used to mean, right? So, like, for instance, like say you overthrow the monarchy and you establish a republic. The republic claims continuity with the entity that kingdom was, right? Even though it's a distinct thing, it's not as though when France went from being a kingdom to being a republic, people said that France ceased to exist, unless they were diehard reactionaries, right? So there's ways in which these things can reproduce, mutate, change retrospectively, that can, I think, achieve some of those goals of viability without being attached to the continuity of a particular entity. And I think this is interesting in the sense of 12-step groups, because one thing I've noticed is that, like, yes, they do tend to fade off and die out, but there are also people who, like, stick around them beyond the purpose of the group existing. And because they get some kind of camaraderie, they get some kind of sense of community from the group, they get some kind of, meaningful social interaction from the group that isn't actually what the group is there to provide. But I guess over time, even if those people do exist in the group, it does tend to die out once it's achieved its goal. And it's only with the creation of a new group by new individuals that you see it kind of come back again, or maybe in a different place. These A or 12-step groups tend to actually have this characteristic of having an expiration date, even though it's not defined in advance.
And I guess, like, we can call back to Boyd as well with the destruction and creation shtick, that, like, having a thing break down, or having a bunch of things break down and then a bunch of new things be constituted out of the parts is healthy, right? Like, you get it would be better for a bunch of 12-step groups to liquidate and then reform a bunch of new ones. Then that would be healthier than to just have the couple of groups that are there just, like, tick along forever and, like, slowly atrophy.
Yeah, and that's why you need what's called, like, an intergroup, which is just a group that is responsible for maintaining the protocol and the kind of know-how. That's what you get at the regional level, national level, international level. But, like, they don't strongly dictate what each group does. It's just that, given that these groups live and die there needs to be a repository for know-how and for protocols. Otherwise, the protocol would be lost itself with their termination.
Exactly. And the author does use the 12-step groups as examples of this stuff, that like people flip between many different meetings. Like somebody might go to Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday, Sunday meetings and see a lot of different faces as they go across these network clusters. And it's a good example of like this kind of very, very distributed and very robust kind of institution. Some of the practice stuff on forming cells is interesting, right? That like the author advises maybe 5 to 10 comrades, and then for each cell, and then each of those people should participate in 2 cells simultaneously. They'd have a home cell and then a secondary one, and if they don't have a secondary one, they should go out and create one. And that's kind of how you have this like contagious mimetic spread, right? Like you're actively going out to do that, but then crucially you're kind of stopping at 2, or like I guess each cell stops at 5 to 10. If it gets any bigger than that, it splits in 2 to form those. And if people find themselves at a loose end where it's like, okay, I don't have a secondary group, I need to go start one. It seems plausible as a model of like contagious spread for organization.
Yes. And they also mentioned that you make your second cell and then you switch from quantitative growth to qualitative growth. So basically achieving the goals of your organization within that 5 to 10 person group, as opposed to, being a trot out on the street with your newspaper trying to recruit as many people as possible to your cell.
The primitive accumulation of cadre, yeah. This is good, right? Because it enshrines a protocol that steers against that kind of accumulation. This seems more plausible as an actually viable model.
I have qualms about this, but I want to save them for later. So we'll just keep going for now.
Sure. Protocols. We all know what protocols are. This is the answer to how do you maintain consistency across this like dynamic, expanding kind of network of cells. You have these behavioral patterns and this like stuff. It's all actually taking direct inspiration from like computing, like TCP/IP, DNS. All these kind of protocols are things that they pin down the ground rules so that everything else can actually go autonomously. Maybe some other examples would be like the rules of the road. That like there are behavioral protocols for driving that permit it. The reason you're able to go anywhere you want or whatever, more or less autonomously, is precisely because there is a protocol in place to decide so much stuff.
Yeah, it's very strange that the author identifies the origin of the term protocol with computing protocols, when it's like, no, like stuff like rules of the road or like rules of etiquette are protocols that like vastly predate the internet or computing for that matter. So no, it's definitely something that like humans have been doing for a very long time. You could even like identify it in like bird communities, that they have protocols that are endogenous to those communities or regions, or like this is something that exists in pretty much every form of life. Even like the mutation of COVID to what was the organism that Omicron formed in? Yeah. It went from humans to mice and then back to humans. It's like, well, in order to interface with the mice cells, it actually changed its mode of operating in terms with the mouse protocol, which means that when it comes back to humans, it's less virulent for us. Yeah.
But in cybernetics, these kind of protocols are recognized as ways that systems tame variety. And there's a funny thing that happens where if you institute these kind of protocols and rules, you slow things down and reduce the variety, but for the sake of speeding it up later. So like you kind of gain you kind of gain compatibility that like makes further autonomous action much easier. It's kind of like giving up a little bit of freedom to gain a lot more freedom down the road. Again, the rules of the road are such a good example of that. That like, you know, prior to there being any protocols for driving, it was fucking chaos, and like it was really hard to drive because you risked death much more than you usually do. I mean, we still risk death all the time driving, but like it's remarkably safe compared to how it was at the dawn of driving, right? And you know, a sort of one might have a knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, they're taking away my freedom to just like plow into a bus stop or whatever and, you know, drive whatever way. It's like, yeah, but you're gaining a lot more by just like sticking to the fucking rules, you know?
One might have such an objection. Never have I met anyone online who had such an objection.
Christ.
Traffic lights, I hate him. That's tyranny.
Yeah, I don't know. It's such a pervasive thing, right? Like, and it's whether it's for driving or for, I don't know, the response to fucking COVID or for anything, or even, you know, frankly, a lot of stuff that I saw in the kind of like anarchist world. It's like, for so many people, like, politics and interpersonal relationships and relationship to social systems and relationship to authority basically takes the form of, fuck you, you're not my real mom, you can't tell me to clean my room.
Yes.
You know? That's the core sentiment that's at the heart of so many things.
It's the point that the German health minister Lauterbach was making when he was quoting Hegel in Parliament.
What was the quote? Like, freedom is the recognition of necessity, or something?
Yes, yeah. We regain freedom through vaccination. It is the virus that confines us. Hegel once said, and in this respect he is right, freedom is the recognition of necessity. So, you know, it is we gain freedom through the rules of the road to use the road and move about the road in a quick manner wherever we like. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that is a good one. What's the next section? Critical feedback. We all know what feedback is.
Yes. This feedback is a system responding to its own outputs, and you're comparing your results against your intentions, and you do error correcting feedback to achieve your intentions. The feedback must be oriented towards a common goal in the system. So these, according to the author, these goals need to emerge, not be decided from above. So obviously that's not universally true of feedback systems, because like, you know, your thermostat has its goals are determined, what do you call that, heteronomously. Like they're determined by the person who designed the thermostat. They're not determined by the thermostat. But for these revolutionary organizations, we must determine our goals. We must be self-legislating, right? We must determine our own goals. And we need a means of developing this common goal and directionality. He writes, they write, the mechanism we propose to guide the feedback process is the simultaneous act of critique. When united, feedback and critique become critical feedback. Critique is the task of identifying the vectors of power that constitute the self. Through critique, we come to identify the operations of governmentality on our bodies and on the production of ourselves as subjects. Identity distinctions, markers of physical and mental ability, categorizations of mental health, traumas, group dynamics, drug addiction. All these features that compose us as subjects are simultaneously vectors of power. This organization of traits we can call, in scare quotes, subjectivity. The critical task is to identify these vectors and thereby to render them as problems susceptible for intervention. So yeah, it's interesting because given the sort of given the sort of thinking that you see in autonomism, it would be easy to think that what autonomism desires is to manifest the true self. But it's not really like that. It's more that, like in Spinoza, you have this notion of God where God is everything. It's pantheistic, right? That the entire natural world in all of its facets and is God, and therefore there is a kind of divine ground of being from which emerges various sorts of happenings, right? And so when we're talking about this kind of like Deleuzian or Spinozist way of thinking about self-development, we're not talking about like finding your true self and then making that manifest in the world. It's more about like manifesting that like infinitely powerful singularity that is the divine ground of being, as opposed to a true self or your soul or something like that, something that is stable and rigidly defined, because that for them would just be another way by which you can be dominated, right? Is like, it's like, it's like when a Christian comes up to you and they're like, oh, good news, friend, like when you die, your immortal soul is going to go to heaven and you will exist in supreme paradise. And it's like, awesome, great, cool. That's great. Thanks for letting me know. Is there a catch? Well, you have to discipline yourself for your entire life because you have this thing tied to you called a soul. And if you don't take care of it right, you're not going to heaven, right? So there's like this gift, but then it's a bait and switch where actually you are disciplined illegitimately by the moral system. So really this is trying to get past that, get beyond that by saying, well, all of these identity distinctions, all of these things that we might call the constituents of our subjectivity are actually vectors of power. And what that means is that they are in movement, right? They exist not as a static thing, but as something that is towards something, and therefore you can kind of escape them through these lines of flight, right? It's this really like kinetic motion-based metaphor of what it is to be oppressed or to be free.
Yeah, to be marked. You know, like you're being marked constantly by these lines and vectors. And if you could just slip out from under the fucking things.
Mm-hmm. They're trying to pull you in their direction.
Yeah. Right, and if you could slip out from under them and just kind of do bullet time dodge around them, like you could maybe get on one of these. What was the thing earlier? Ride the snake. You just hop on the good line of flight and ride the snake to the end. Yeah.
Exactly. You ride the snake to multitudinous ecstasy.
Mm-hmm. God, yeah. It's just it sounds so much like a Ronnie James Dio fucking album, you know.
Exactly. I can't read anything in multitude without just like thinking about like a ayahuasca trip or something. You know, it's all just wild.
Like a Hawkwind record. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
Yeah. But like, I mean, stripping off some of the bong rip, I think some of the kind of like the aspects here of like naming the enemy is worthwhile, and it does come up a bit later under like consciousness raising. That like if you're kind of able to kind of name the kind of ways in which you've been marked, and like if we could do it together, you know, kind of work out all these ways that kind of you get put under these marks. There's the possibility of liberation there.
Yes, and this is definitely something that's like recognizable in any kind of oppressed community that becomes a community for itself, to use the dreaded Hegelian terminology, just to which I'm sure the autonomous would not like. But if you do become conscious, right, through like quote unquote consciousness raising, as they mention here, you start to recognize these marks, recognize these symptoms of oppression. So it's like, for example, like my personal experience is like with like ADHD TikTok, right? It's like people just being like, oh my God, like you have that. I also have that. You suffer from this. I also suffer from this. Oh my God, there's a pattern here. There's something meaningful behind this. There's such a thing as being neurodivergent. There's such a thing as that being valid as opposed to simply being defective. Like, and the author mentions like feminist consciousness raising too, right? Where it's like, oh, like your husband beats you, my husband beats me too. You're tired taking care of the kids all the time. I am too. Like you feel unfulfilled because you didn't get to pursue your passions and instead were forced into a situation of limited domesticity. Well, I felt that too. And then you start to get a program out of these processes to become otherwise.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's a precondition for going anywhere with that, right? Like going from my problem to our problem is really crucial for there to be any kind of collective action to remediate these problems. Like it's really impossible to conceive of that kind of action without this consciousness raising, this critical feedback.
Yeah, that's where a System 5 is so powerful, right? That if you don't have a System 5, you don't have an organism. And if you don't have an organism, you don't have the capacity for operating as an organism.
Mm-hmm. Can't do anything, yeah. This example that's used a bit after the feminist consciousness raising is Techmill, which I hadn't heard of before. Were you familiar with this?
No. It sounds like a modified form of like struggle sessions, basically. So it says, drawn from the Kurdish movement, Techmill is a process of constructive group criticism. Briefly, Techmill involves the group coming together and taking turns offering criticism and self-criticism about group dynamics. Techmill sessions are led by facilitators who are responsible for moderating group dynamics and taking notes on the session. Importantly, participants are not allowed to respond to criticism directly, and once a criticism has been made, the same criticism is not repeated by other participants. So like you don't have a dogpiling situation. Once each person has had the opportunity to state their criticisms and self-criticisms, the group moves on to a second round where participants propose solutions to the problems raised. Through this process of group criticism, future group activity, actions, and individual and collective behaviors can be modified. I understand the need for something like this in the sense that like you need to have communication. It's like if you want to have like an effective couple or effective polycule or whatever, you need to have these kinds of conversations in order to continue adapting, right? And if you don't have the conversations, if you just keep everything bottled up, then you're just going to end up blowing up at each other and things are going to take a bad turn. So completely understand the need for this, but it does also sort of smack of struggle sessions and like cult shit that I've heard of from people who have been in cults. So I think that it's a fine line you have to navigate in these things, where it's like, okay, the facilitator can't actually become a leader. The criticisms shouldn't come with the expectation that the group is always right, and the proposal of solutions shouldn't be about obviating the individual in the name of the collective will, right? So, for instance, you can have like a cult where they'll be like, oh, this is all about wellness. It's all about getting better. Like we're all here to do therapy on ourselves and all, here to just be better people. But the expectation of being a better person through the process of criticism and self-criticism can actually be about brainwashing somebody, because you invalidate their personal perceptions in favor of the ones that are asserted by the group, which is like, and there's a lot of like groupthink about, whatever the powerful person says is important, everybody else needs to like internalize. So the fact that you can't dogpile here is a way to prevent that to a degree. And the fact that the facilitator is a facilitator and not a leader also helps with that. But it is definitely a concern, because when you create groups like this of say 5 to 10 people, and they're involved in this process of self-improvement, collectively, the degree of intimacy that exists in that environment can be very dangerous if it is abused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally right. Like, yes, yeah, the group size thing is interesting because in many ways it's a lot harder when the groups are small, because they're more intimate.
Yes, unless it's like they were describing where the cells are subsumed in a larger organization, but they're still cells.
Like, I could imagine it being easier and probably more productive to run a session of this that's like 50 or something people rather than like, 5 to 10, because like it feels analogous to that problem we see in like trying to unionize tech workers, whatever, where if you're in a like small company, like a startup or whatever, and there's like maybe 5, 10, 15 people in the whole thing, it's much harder to get, it's much harder to get for workers to get traction against the bosses when it's that intimate. Whereas it's a fair bit easier when it's Google, because like the battle lines are kind of drawn much more clearly, and it's like, with Google it's much easier for you as a worker to see that they're fucking you over. But when you're in a kind of tiny startup, it's like, what, Dave's fucking me over? What are you talking about? That sort of thing. It's so much harder when the groups are smaller and they're more intimate. So yeah, this would be hard to balance.
Yeah, it's a really tricky thing, because the reason why it's easier to organize in a large organization is because there's a degree of alienation that's implied there. And so the counterpoint would be like, well, you should be in a small organization so that you're not existing in an alienated organization in the first place. And like, you see with 12-step groups, they are about this size, right? They aren't larger than that, and they do what they do. And there's a certain degree to which it's okay, because if there is abuse, that kind of thing in the organization, then you can just fold the organization. But as somebody who's been through like kind of like small cultish organizations in the past, I also wouldn't understate the amount of harm that you can get even from like, hey, this is fucked up. Oh my God, I'm leaving now. Brief interaction like that. So it's really tough.
I guess another way it's tough is that, I guess another thing that flows out of the groups being small is that, when you have fewer people, a swing is more severe. You know what I mean? So like with 3 people, a swing of one person on an issue is a full like 66 to 33, sort of ratio. Whereas in a large group, a swing of 1 or 2 people is, 49 to 51 or whatever. it's tricky. It's real fucking tricky because that's it's lower resolution and is more. I guess it's just more, when the swing is that severe, even if it's just a kind of coin toss of one person or whatever, it kind of makes that big a difference, Maybe the thing here is that like there's something that's possibly underexplored in leftist thought, that like to some degree, like a certain amount of scale and a certain amount of alienation, a certain amount of distance from your comrades is actually healthy and productive and might actually be preferable,
Yes. Yeah, I think there's like all kinds of advantages and disadvantages, because like there definitely are circumstances where being in a larger organization has its benefits. It's like in in the VSM, if all 5 systems are composed in a group of 10 people, then doing system 3-star, the audit stuff, is pretty much restricted to like either doing back channel communication or doing this kind of Techmill thing. Whereas if you're in a larger organization, then you could say, bring in people who are still part of your organization to do an audit, but who are not a part of like your everyday working group, right? And so that's not to say that prevents abuse necessarily, because like look at trot organizations, right? Like they have that size, they have that organization where it's like, oh, if there's going to be an investigation, it's going to be an investigation set up by the central committee then makes a total clown show out of it, and the abuse is suppressed or whatever. Like just think about what happened with the SWP. But again, that's one of those situations where it's like there's the central committee and then there are cells, and there is no like general assembly or larger venues because every cell is kind of broken up from each other. So that's a network power imbalance. I think this is something like we need to explore more, because it's been coming up in other situations too, but like just kind of like small group psychology stuff, the relationship between quantity and quality in group networks, right? It's very important.
Yeah, it's crucially important. I wonder if this stuff is probably, the small group psychology stuff is probably pretty well covered in, I guess, ordinary bourgeois kind of, management stuff and like organizational stuff. So maybe that's the place to look for that, rather than like, the paper of some trot group who probably don't do very well at this.
Yeah. No, there's like plenty of research that is outside of like the Marxist like orbit, which probably is worth reading. We just haven't done it. Yeah.
The last section then is discipline and control. This is where they bring in the surrender bit from the 12-step thing. And the author kind of really starts going down this route with that like we really can't seem to get anywhere by just trying to do individual will sort of stuff, and that like I guess in the AA it's like this surrendering to a power greater than oneself, it takes on this very religious sort of connotation, but I guess what's proposed here is just kind of revolutionary discipline, I guess, that like, hey, let's not try to just fucking do this all individually by sheer will. Let's like actually organize and be kind of disciplined about it.
Yeah, I think this is a little underbaked, because like it's like, okay, in AA you are surrendering to God, and like as you understand him, quote unquote, and the point there is that in doing so you experience a shift of perspective where the problem isn't one of self-will and self-management as an individual, but one where you are in the context of this like infinite benevolence that is in the world that just gives you the ability to step out of that like circuit of thinking, right? Of oh, I need to discipline myself this way and that way and the other way. It's like no. Like you're not alone. In fact, there's an infinite benevolent power in the world that is here to help you. And I think there's definitely a certain power to substituting the revolutionary process for God there as like a greater power, because it is in fact a greater power. Like once a revolutionary process is going, it is a greater power than an individual. That's a fact. But it also can't be taken as infinitely benevolent, because like God is a thing that is like maximally abstract, right? It is unless you're talking about like say an embodied like God with a personality, right? Like, you know, Zeus or whatever. It's a very, very thin concept, right? It's just, oh, it's all powerful, it's all knowing, and it's good. Okay. Like, that's all you need to know about it. That's all there is to it. And whatever empirical things you see in your life are beyond any relationship to these facts about God. Whereas a revolutionary process is a specific empirical process that is happening in the real world and can in fact go quite badly. It probably isn't very well served by people being totally uncritical about it, because like, I mean, the point about God there is that God is an unconditional agency, an unconditional being. Like, you don't need to engage your thinking mind to dissect the motivations and actions of God in this sense. It's just, oh, just God is all powerful. God is good. That's all you need to know. But you can't help but do that with a revolution, or if you're not, it's pretty scary, because then you're in the realm of being a complete zealot, right? So I think that it maps in the sense that the revolution is a power greater than oneself, but it doesn't map in the three steps that come out of AA, because these aren't the same things, right? So like, okay, we are powerless over capitalism. Our lives have become unmanageable. Yeah, sure, absolutely true. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Yeah, sure, the revolutionary movement, the real movement, right? And we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Point 3, I don't think so. Turn our lives over to the revolution, yes. Turn our will over to the revolution, that is one of those things where it's like, yes, but like it's extrinsic, right? It's like I don't completely identify with the revolutionary process, even if a part of my will is involved with it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like, I think at its best, this is actually fairly straightforward, like, appeal to the autonomists and the anarchists to like get their shit together and actually like collaborate properly and not think solely about their own themselves, whatever. And to, you know, the kind of exhortation to group discipline that would be just totally banal to like MLs or whatever. I think some of this is like it comes out of the kind of people that the author is addressing. It seems to come out of personal frustrations with like it's directed at a very particular kind of person. At its worst, it's like Shining Path fucking shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think you're right that like the comparisons being made here doesn't exactly fit, but like throughout the essay, the author kind of puts some emphasis on like healing and personal restoration and like group healing and restoration, like that. I guess the only way to heal and to get over these kind of problems is to surrender some of your will to a kind of group system that actually helps you get over the problem, right? To put it in those kind of terms.
That's totally reasonable, right? Like it's like, it's like saying, well, the only way to like break a COVID wave is to submit to public health measures, and that's going to overall improve your well-being. And it's like, okay, yeah, reasonable enough. Like I give up a bit of my liberty in order to achieve a different kind of freedom. Fine, that makes complete sense. But to give over my will is a step too far.
Yeah, totally. And there's almost a kind of irony here. There's something that's tickling my brain in a weird way, that like for everything that was said about wellness and the kind of problems with that kind of culture, there's some of this stuff later that almost reads like imploring autonomists and anarchists to become like self-help cults or something. That's the kind of cells that we're going to create. Oh, I don't know.
Yeah. When it's focused on healing and consciousness raising, primarily, at the end there, it's like, yeah, it's definitely of a similar kind of thing. And 12-step groups are literally self-help groups, right? Like it's about, just average anonymous individuals coming together to help each other as a collectivity is self-help. Because like a lot of sort of self-help stuff isn't necessarily just about individuals. It can also be about communities doing self-help, right? Miners, like back in the day before the NHS existed and miners did their own health insurance thing, that was self-help, right?
That's the the best interpretation kind of goes that way. It's something a tiny bit worrying somewhere in here, I don't know, as well. It's hard not to kind of feel a little bit worried in some ways. But the best possible interpretation is good.
Oh, especially as somebody who's been burned by groups like this. Justified skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know, some of the conclusions or whatever are kind of, I don't know, less objectionable. Like this, I think one of the ways it's put is that like we're not gaining freedom from discipline and control, but gaining freedom via discipline and control, which definitely has a kind of dark interpretation, but also has a interpretation that just fits with everything we've been talking about. Like, and the rules of the road actually do set you free from certain privations.
Yeah, it's like how that quote that the Hegel quote that was quoted by the German health minister could be completely reasonable in that context and in many contexts. But it also was frequently cited by like the GDR to justify like social oppression, right? Like that it's like oh yeah, we need the Berlin Wall because you have to recognize necessity, and that's real freedom. Being trapped behind this wall with soldiers on it that are going to shoot you if you try to leave is actually freedom because you're recognizing necessity.
Mm-hmm. I guess that's the other thing that's kind of floating around in the back of my mind. That's it's it's a worry about something that's not necessarily entirely in the piece, but it's something that else it triggers in my brain. That, like, you know, we've seen folks get a little bit too much into the GDR stuff in recent times, and you know, we're seeing this like patriotic socialism or whatever the fuck kind of emerge, and it's like, I don't know, I can see the dark, ugly stuff brewing as well, that like some of what's on the page doesn't entirely disagree with, you know what I mean? There's something, I don't know, maybe my my spidey senses are a little bit oversensitive these days, but
it's not like nationalistic or anything like that in this article, and like sort of meets all of the anarchist criteria for, you know, being properly revolutionary, but I think a healthy amount of skepticism is useful whenever going into these small group situations, and maybe there are ways to better organize things to sort of promote safety and to qualify to whatever degree is possible that submission to the real movement with a kind of rational examination of your circumstances and honesty with yourself. Because, like, I think that those are qualities that you need in a revolution, even if it means that you might get thrown in jail or killed, right? Is like, you know, it's never okay to completely, or to throw your reason to the wind and to deny the validity of your own experience, right? Because those points are sort of like a necessary corrective to the swinginess of revolutions, where ambitious people will just manipulate whatever way the wind is blowing and push it in the most extreme direction possible, which may be the right thing to do in some situations, and that's fine, but also could be a complete fucking disaster, and anyone who criticizes it is against the will of the revolution, so obviously they just don't count. So you need to have like counterbalancing forces in a revolution, and it's important to emphasize that.
Yeah. Shall we move on to the conclusion?
Yeah. There was one point that was interesting to me. This mentorship point. Basically, just you're in these two groups, your primary and your secondary, and then you have a mentor, but the mentor is somebody who's from neither the primary or the secondary. That's quite a nice check on that in-group cult shit. As long as, you know, it doesn't spread too far, right? It's a good idea. I think it's a very good idea, and definitely support that kind of notion.
It reminds me of something I think we saw. Something we read with, was it in the Lumio interview? Maybe that like they have the buddy system, yeah. So like yeah, exactly. So you have like a kind of third party that's I don't know, like outside of the team that you're on, and isn't also your I don't know how did it structured. Like
it was like there was like a chain of like individual to individual to individual, but then the buddy thing like kind of like jumped out of that chain, so it wasn't like, so that there was some degree of reflexivity, and it wasn't just like stuck in a like, you know, there's one person helping me and I'm helping one other person and I can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah, there's always somebody else there as well. I think it's a solid escape hatch from a lot of these problems. So I mean, in the conclusion, it's just a bit of a wrap up on like that these are proposals for like trying to get towards long-term solutions to all these problems that plague us, right? And that it kind of really is, as it's put here, that like it's a revolutionary project to develop our capacities and to basically overcome trauma. Like that developing capacities and healing trauma are actually, their themes that run all throughout the piece. And that it's more understandable why the AA and 12-step stuff is such a focus there. It's like that is what they're concerned with.
Yeah, and it makes sense that like you can't be a good revolutionary subject if you are dominated by the sad passions, if you are overwhelmed by your trauma, and if you are causing harm to others by reenacting it, right? Like, there is a totally legitimate, like, functional explanation for why that healing does need to take place. And also, it's a good counterbalance to the tendency of left spaces being ones where, like, traumatized people and people who are there to prey on traumatized people gather, and like focus exclusively on the goals of the organization as opposed to their personal needs.
That stuff is so tricky, right? Because and it's a thing that's really hard to articulate, because I guess it's hard to say it, and with the sort of it's hard to talk about this stuff with the required level of kindness and sensitivity, because like I guess one of my big critiques of a lot of the left, and this is really also a self-critique, is that like we tend to be pretty dysfunctional people, and not often the kind of people you would want to be building the next society, frankly, you know. But it's very hard to say that without it feeling like it's just cruelty against people who have already had a pretty hard time, you know. But it's also true still. Like, I mean, even if it's hard to swallow, it's still true, right? Like, and the way the author puts it here is that, like, we have to become the sort of people who could successfully take a revolutionary situation to its conclusion. And if we're really honest, like, looking around a lot of the left as it exists now, it's just not the case, you know, for a huge variety of reasons. But again, it's so hard because, like, often you are dealing with people and communities of people who are trying to fight back against oppression, trying to heal in some way, and it feels cruel to point out that we're not actually very good at succeeding at that. You know what I mean? Like, it's a very, very hard thing. It's a very hard line of conversation to have.
Yeah, well, and I guess it helps to be upfront about it that, like, as they sort of say here, like, you can't come from a background of oppression and not be marked by it. And it's about accepting that that's true, but also acknowledging that being like, you're not going to make the revolution as a broken person or a collective of broken people. Like, you have to somehow engage literally in self-help to become, you know, at least somewhat functional individuals and get this done, because no one else is going to do it. Like, if you come from a cushy middle-class lifestyle and you just go to a cushy middle-class life, you're never going to give a shit about any of this stuff in a way that would cause you to do anything about it, as opposed to just having a bleeding heart. Like, it's like, you know, not to say that there aren't people from those backgrounds that do go on to become revolutionaries, but it's usually because some form of oppression touches on their personal experience. It's not the people who are like, oh yeah, my family's happy, I'm happy, my town's happy, everything around me's happy, and I just want to play sports and live in my big house. Like, that is not the sort of person that's going to become a revolutionary. And so, like, yeah. So we just, like, yeah, we just have to, like, accept that this is the situation we find ourselves in, and it is never gonna just go away and fix itself because there's no systemic reason why it would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the meantime, there can be an upside to acknowledging that, because we can maybe develop a more realistic sense of what we're actually doing and what the possibilities on the ground really are at any given time. So, reading a quote here, for instance, when we reflect back on the failures of the autonomous zones during the George Floyd uprising, perhaps the problem was not that the gestures themselves were incorrect. It's that we are not yet the kind of people who could successfully occupy a liberated territory. And as you've noted here, yeah, that's the understatement of the century, right? Because a lot of people were surprised that it's like when the autonomous zones fell apart, and they fell apart because people had just murdered 2 kids for no fucking reason, basically. When all that shit dissolved, some people were very surprised that was the outcome. I was less surprised, you know what I mean? It's not a super functional fucking thing, you know what I mean? And when we find that kind of surprise, we have to ask ourselves, why are we surprised by it? Did we think that was the actual, I don't know, was maybe the sort of model and reality are misaligned if we're not seeing those kinds of things as problems, you know?
Well, and it also, just the people in the autonomous zones weren't able to see wreckers for who they were and act reasonably in response to that, right? Because it's just oh, we're open, anybody can come in, all opinions are valid, etc., etc. That's not how you occupy liberated territory. You have to have, not just methods of demonstration, but also methods of self-defense, and not just against physical violence, but against malicious infiltration. And the people who occupied those autonomous zones were not the kind of people who had those capacities. So this is not to say, oh, I would have done better. It's just to say, yeah, this is a fact. There was no, there were people who could see what was going on, but they weren't able to steer things in a better direction. Absolutely. And that is well, yeah, that means we don't have the capacities for organization to actually create a resilient liberated territory. And that's kind of why all of this BSM stuff, all of that, all of these considerations we're talking about in this essay are important and relevant, is because we need to have different capacities. We need to be different people who can do different things.
Yeah, I mean, I remember at the time saying that if we're lucky, that event would kind of be remembered as this is something that sets a mark for you must be this tall to ride or whatever. That if you're going to entertain doing any of these autonomous zones or whatever in the future, you have to have an answer for how are you going to preemptively organize to avoid the situation where people just get randomly murdered. That there has to be an answer for that after this event. And if you don't have an answer for how that's not going to go that badly again, then you're not ready to do an autonomous zone, you know?
Yeah. And that's even putting aside all the things of well, are you really autonomous if you exist at the pleasure of the police, not attacking you, right? That's not actually autonomy. That's just heteronomy in a different guise, because the determining power is the police, not you.
And also, the cops have now learned that the way to deal with this kind of thing is to literally just sit there and wait until the occupiers just fuck up of their own accord.
Yeah, I mean,
they don't actually need to move in and push you out. You'll liquidate yourselves pretty easily while they wait, you know?
Yeah, which is opposite of what happened in Ottawa, right? With these right-wing assholes who occupied the city center. The police sat on their hands and did nothing, and they didn't show any signs of actually self-destructing. So then they escalated to actually physically removing them from the site.
They had to move in then, yeah. Yeah. And you gotta wonder, like, it's pretty damning when, our side makes some sort of move, and the other side, like the cops, their response is literally just, no, don't do anything. These guys will fuck it up on their own time, you know? That's pretty damning when that's the lesson that's taken away. Anyway, let's talk about these principles at the end.
These are principles sort of modeled on the 12-step principles, but are relevant to the kind of vital cell organization they're talking about in this article. So the first is the principle of feedback. Do we provide feedback such that individuals involved in our organization can grow? So, constructive feedback, literally. 2 is the principle of difference. Do we organize across differences? If not, what needs to be done to make the group more resonant with its outside? So is it, all a bunch of people look exactly like each other, or are we actually reaching out? 3 is the critical principle. Does the vital cell begin from our lived perceptions, from our own experiences of suffering within this world? Right? Okay. So instead of beginning from the phenomenology of spirit is pretty cool or something like that. Base it in meaningful experiences, not just abstract program or fan club thing. For the principle of multiplicity, does the vital cell allow for multiple truths to proceed towards collective growth? Right. So is it plural instead of being a monoculture? 5th is the vital principle. Through our cell, do we find ourselves on the path to a more vital participation in the world? Does participation in the cell help us grow in our capacities? Does it help us overcome obstacles on this path? So is it getting you down, or is it actually helping you? And then 6, the principle of open-endedness. Does it promote becoming without posing an ideal figure of growth? In other words, does our cell foster open-ended growth regardless of where one is coming from and without recourse to normative ideals, for example, of communism or wellness archetypes, etc.? So that's like the reification thing. And then principle 7, the principle of autonomy. Can members participate while maintaining their autonomy? So, does the group make you give over all your property to them, or are you able to kind of live your own life outside of that group? That kind of thing. And then principle 8, the principle of revolution. Does the vital cell maintain a revolutionary orientation while building immediate power? Well, when each of these questions can be answered in the affirmative, then a vital cell has been formed.
Mm-hmm. They seem pretty good. Nice little checklist to check off against. I also like the kind of, it's like a kind of diagnostic framing, much like Beer's VSM stuff. Like, this is how you would go diagnosing a thing. Here's a heuristic for identifying if something's going well or not. So I guess that's the essay. Any wrap-up thoughts? I guess we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah. I think the only thing I would say is that because of this cell-to-cell structure that they've set up here, I think there's a reasonable connection to the 12-step groups, like it maps. I could see it spreading. I could see it being constructive for the individuals involved. But I think that the issue is that this organizational form wouldn't have any capacity for strategy. So if you're talking about tactics, yes, absolutely could do that. But if we look at that sort of sliding scale in Boyd of moving from tactics to grand strategy, those higher levels are things that these vital cells would not be capable of doing, because there would be no mechanism by which to decide, like, whose strategic perspectives are valid, and even like to disseminate it, or sorry, not to disseminate it, but to work together on strategic perspectives. Because it's just like I could see them maybe doing like operational stuff of like, hey, here's 5 groups, like we have this thing we all care about, let's like do a temporary project together to make this happen, right? This is like something that affects our region. But if you were talking about like sort of theater level strategic concerns, I cannot see these groups ever articulating the capacity to act on that level of problem. They just would not be able to do it.
Yeah, I think so. I think to get there, you need to go to VSM stuff, I guess. But then you're kind of...
It's VSM stuff, but like the VSM has to be the start of a diagnostic of why your System 4 is anemic, right? Like it's... The VSM is a diagnostic tool, so it doesn't provide an organizational form that meets its, like, as the recommendation for what meets its criteria. So I think that you would have to say, like, maybe these vital cells are good for capacity building, for getting things off the ground, but then you would have to move to the VSM diagnostic of, like, where are they inadequate and how could we maintain our principles while articulating something that is more adaptable to larger, more abstract problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally right. Because the vital cells thing is not recursive, right? It's one layer of a network. Whereas, and so I could imagine this being applicable at the bottom level System 1 stuff of a wider system. So you've got individuals, then you've got as System 1s or whatever, and then they cohere into vital cells, and then those vital cells are cohered into you kind of use the VSM stuff from there on out to cohere upwards into larger things, but that like recursive coherence isn't in this piece.
Yeah, and what is described here sort of describes a broader organization that has Systems 1, that has a strong System 2 in the form of its protocols, right? But has no System 3, a little bit of a System 3 star in the way that mentorship works, right? That kind of like group to group thing, and the like primary secondary connections, has a sort of like nebulous System 4 that would just be like word of mouth between cells, right? And then has a System 5, which is about being vital cells and being revolutionary and the principles. So it's like the System 3 and System 4 are very weak in what is being described here, and would need to be bolstered if they were to be effective beyond those particular domains, because like each vital cell would have, Systems 1 through 5 all to itself. It's just when you go above that to the network of vital cells that you get into that problem of like 3 and 4 being really weak.
Definitely, yeah. I think that's fair. And without that, without those higher level structures, it would be at risk of just kind of devolving back into the. You could just have the same problems again of like, hey, affinity groups don't. Yeah, the affinity groups basically don't manage to get anything done. Like, with. So yeah. It's there's still something not present here that's needed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like It's like when Sartre talks about the Communist Party and like how it's supposed to be able to coordinate between struggles here and there. And like that's why it's valuable. It's like, yeah, like that is a valid point, assuming that's what communist parties actually did and ignoring all of the other problems with the Leninist party form, right? Like it's like that point of coordination and strategizing is still necessary even if you accept all of the real problems with Leninism, right? Yeah.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you for listening to General Intellect Unit, and we hope you'll join us again next time. While you wait, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod, you can find us on the web at generalintellectunit.net, and you can find us on all the podcast apps, so like, rate, and subscribe. If you go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and give us a couple of bucks a month, you can help support the show and get access to our community Discord. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows such as Swampside Chats, Jumpsuit Utopia, From Alpha to Omega, and Mortal Science. They're all excellent shows and excellent folks. Once again, thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next time.